This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, from Philadelphia to Erie and from Pittsburgh to Scranton, it's Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenwald, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy, and I'm joined as usual by my co-host, Maura Donnelly. Welcome, Maura.
Hello, Charlie.
Why, today we are very lucky to have some of the most interesting and some of the most well-respected experts on state government and state politics with us today.
We are. This is going to be a great show. Great show.
I am absolutely sure it will be. And the person that put this together was Chris Nicholas. Chris, you've been with us before, and we want to welcome you back.
Thank you.
You, of course, are a Republican political consultant and head of Eagle Consulting Group. And you have recently put together a political podcast, which has brought together some of the best reporters in the state, and it's on something called the Pennsylvania Political Digest. Will you tell us a little bit about what you've done with these two special reporters?
Well, look, it's like we're almost all constitutionally mandated, Charlie, to have our own podcast at some time. So I have been thinking about it for a while. A lot of political podcasts are two people talking about current events, which is fine. I wanted to do something a little bit different. And at the beginning of the year, I was talking with Brad Bumstead, who had recently retired, and he just retired from the Lancaster newspaper group, and they wrote, a nice little puff piece about his career. And I called him to congratulate him. And halfway during the call, I said, wouldn't it be great, I just blurted it out, if we did a podcast on political corruption in the state? And he said yes. And before I knew it, the next thing I said is, wouldn't it be great if we also got John Baer, the former political columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News, involved? And he said yes. And then I said, well, gosh, I better ask John before we go any further. And over the course of the next couple of weeks, I was able to hook up with him. And I produced and hosted this podcast, which is called A Stroll Through the Annals of Pennsylvania Political Corruption. Brad has written 2 books on political corruption, and John has written 1 book on Pennsylvania politicos and their interesting stories. So my goal was not to relitigate the details of all these cases, but to bring out what I call the nooks and crannies and the only in Pennsylvania parts of these political corruption scandals. And so you can go to papoliticaldigest.com and listen to them if you're a podcast person and already have that software on your phone or your tablet. You can just look up PA Political Digest. I wanted to keep them shorter, so they're all 35 to 45 minutes. Each episode, there's 5, has a primary and secondary story. Even though I'm a Republican political consultant, we took an equal opportunity view of corruption in the state, so there's Democrats and Republicans. And the first question I always get is, why do you only limit it to 5? And, we wanted to talk about ones that were interesting to talk about and that had some meat on the bone left. And so we covered a wide-ranging variety of them. And these guys, having covered it as newspaper reporters and written about it, my job was to kind of, put the blinders on about where we're going to do each thing. And then after that, I just kind of let them go because they're just fonts of information on this. And of course, I wouldn't say this privately, but they really know their stuff here, right? So it's really important that they have a chance to talk about this. And the great feedback we got from people, besides it was interesting, is for a lot of younger folks, it was a political history lesson.
Yes.
Even though some of these things happened, less than a decade ago, there's so much turnover in politics. So it was a labor of love, and I really enjoyed doing it with these guys.
And we want to thank you, Chris, for welcoming the other, introducing our other 2 guests. John Baer and Brad Bumstead have both been on the show before, and we welcome both of you back.
Thank you, Charlie.
And it's so nice to recreate your political digest here. And a lot of the things that you're talking about has occurred, some of it within our lifespan. But some of us are older than others.
Well, that's true. I mean, your lifespan's longer than mine, Charlie.
Yes,
But they were mostly from the modern era, as we say. But Brad and John both were insistent that one of the first episodes talk about the building scandal of the beautiful Capitol that's just a couple hundred feet from where we sit today. That was 1905. And John, you said it was how much money in today's money, the building scandal?
Well, it would be like $500 million.
But there was only a third of that appropriated for the building.
Right.
So it got interesting after that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's go through some of your podcasts.
Some of the greatest hits.
Some of the
Greatest
well,
hits.
so I'm going to give kind of an off-the-wall question to start, so we'll see how awake everybody is today. One of the themes that I'm seeing through your podcast is that a lot of these politicos that you are talking about, Kathleen Kane being one of them, they were all quote-unquote rising stars. There was a lot of hope being pinned on them for futures in politics, some as far as going to the presidency. And, then we have Shaka Fatah was another one that was going to be a rising star. There's a theme here of some of these. I don't know whether it's that they got too big for their britches, as my mother would say. What do you see here in terms of what happens to these people who have it all and manage to throw it away?
Well, that's very perceptive, and it is. If it's not rising stars, it's wannabe rising stars, because there are a number of people like Al Benedict, former state treasurer, who just thought he had to become governor, but he wasn't exactly a rising star. But he kept trying, and to get the money for it, he sold state jobs for campaign contributions. Didn't work out. But,
Quite as he had hoped.
but no, you're right. And I mean, I think we talked about it in one episode of the podcast, that this desire for higher office is what was the downfall of a lot of these people. Rob McCord is another one, state treasurer, who wanted to be governor but was blown out in a Democratic primary for governor by Tom Wolf's money, and just got desperate and started shaking down state contractors for money, not knowing, of course, that it was wired and the feds were listening. So, there are many, many instances of people, Kathleen Kane, just went too far, but she was clearly somebody who was a rising star. Others were as well. It wasn't all that, but greed is another factor. Ways, it's right up there with rising star. But
And revenge.
Yeah.
one.
Yes.
Maura, you're absolutely right, and we did talk about it both on and off air on the podcast. And one of the elements that always struck me is so many of these people were really smart and talented and knew politics and played politics. So many of them would have been candidates for governor. Some were candidates for governor. Some wanted to be, and they very easily could have made it had they not gone too far. And it's just another example of people who get power, see power, just kind of lose the moral context that's necessary, in this case, to stay out of prison. And that's a pretty high bar, but they managed to cross it anyway.
And it's an argument that can be made for a resign to run law in Pennsylvania. A lot of these people...
Which Philadelphia has, but the state doesn't.
Yeah, but for statewide office, because a lot of these people used the office that they had to run for the next office. Used it in terms of contracts, campaign contributions, illegal activity.
So Rob McCord was state treasurer. He'd just come off a big second-term win as state treasurer. Our state row offices are term limited. You can only run twice. So in his mind, and in many people's minds, he was the logical, best candidate for governor in the 2014 Democratic primary. John tells a story about going to his reception at Pennsylvania Society in New York in January of 2013, and I'll let you recount it. But
Well, he had a fabulous reception at the Four Seasons Hotel in New York, and it was packed because everybody you talked to at that particular Pennsylvania Society and at that reception believed he was going to be the Democratic nominee. Tom Wolf was going to run. Nobody knew to what extent he was going to invest. He came out with $10 million of his own money. He came out with terrific television ads, and McCord got desperate, as Brad said, and things didn't go well for him beyond that.
And as one of the prosecutors who was involved with McCord, not at the beginning but at the end, said he got back so little You know, he threw away his reputation and his life, and as I say in the podcast, for a couple $100,000 of extra TV ads. This is a guy who was Harvard educated, and as we say in the podcast, ended up being a yoga instructor after he got arrested. So that's a pretty big fall from
Well, he-
Harvard educated to being a yoga instructor because you wanted to buy more TV ads to keep up with, in this case, Tom Wolfe.
He had a highly successful technology career. That's how I knew him, met him a couple different times when he was working in technology companies. So it's kind of interesting. That's a pretty big fall.
Yeah, we saw that a lot, that people, again, stretching. And the other big kind of conclusion we came to is that both Philadelphia and NEPA stands for Northeast PA, NEPA, NEPA, the Scranton, Wilkes-Barre area. Philadelphia and NEPA both punched above their weight class when it came to political corruption. We talked about that a lot in the 4th and 5th episodes, because if you're trying to draw kind of a string through all of these, what was it? And I'll let Brad explain some of the reasons why we came to that conclusion, especially up in NEPA.
Yeah, NEPA there's a confluence of several factors. One, it's culture and history as having been, the Scranton and Wilkes-Barre having been company towns where people are used to doing what the bosses want. And in modern times, you had a heavy union influence there and mob influence. People forget that Russell Buffalino, who was really the head of the Northeast crime family for a while, lived in a little town outside of Wilkes-Barre. So those factors contributed to NEPA punching above its weight class, as we say. And the corruption was pervasive there in the court system, and the FBI later brought a whole bunch of cases against local officials, school board officials, school board administrators, for selling teacher positions and other things. And I'm talking about 10 years ago, So, I mean, it's just very, very corrupt, and people there know it, but they sort of smile and move on. What are you going to do? And they become hardened to it like they are in Philadelphia. I mean, there comes a time where you just go like, another one's gone down.
There's another great factor, a cultural factor in the NEPA story that is tied to the fact that as coal receded, government grew, and people who might have been in the industry, in the energy industry, turned to politics, and suddenly politics became the game of Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, so much so that Vince Caroci, a former press secretary to the late Governor Casey, told me when he was growing up in Scranton, all the other kids played with baseball cards. Outside of Scranton, in Scranton, they had politics cards. They had cards of people in office, candidates, local, state, federal.
That's
so I mean,
hardcore.
that is hardcore politics.
That's starting them early.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
John, you said something, I want to go back to both of you. You talked about the Benedict Wolf race and talked about Wolf's ads. It was one ad, the Jeep ad,
Yeah.
that he first came out with. That ad was so good. I remember being in the office with Senator Jubelier, and Senator Jubelier said, "That's the best political ad I've ever seen. Maybe even as good as Reagan's Bear in the Woods ad, or just as good or better." Where do you rank that? And that was the ad that ran all through the season, and it was like
Well,
that
it was-
ad alone. Did that ad alone elect him?
Well, it certainly helped. It was the first ad out of the chute. It was during a time when we were having a polar vortex. Everybody was inside watching television. You talk about good luck.
Good timing, good timing.
The ad won a bunch of awards. Saul Shore was the ad maker. He's a national Democratic consultant who also works for now Senator Casey and now Governor Shapiro. So, I mean, he knows Pennsylvania. He knows what works in Pennsylvania. And the highlight of the ad, from my standpoint, was one of the daughters is talking about their father, Tom Wolfe, and he says, and he also drives a Jeep. And the shot is him coming down the street waving like this. Now, if that's not a friendly guy, and one of us right there in his Pennsylvania Jeep.
Which the state police would then not let him drive for a long
Once he
period,
got in
once he became
office.
governor. But I think it's something.
But he still took it to the Capitol.
He did. It's also the strategy involved with a great ad, and that's spending the money up front as opposed to waiting until the final 3 weeks of the campaign, which is what most people do, and which most of them were thinking about doing. But meantime, you're blown away. It's like it's like the top of the lineup hits 3 grand slams, you can't catch up.
Yeah, normally in politics, you work backwards from election day for your TV and direct mail. That's because you have to raise the money. Tom Wolfe famously didn't lend him his campaign $10 million, he just gave it. So he could start early. So from late January to early March, he was the only person on TV. There were a lot of Democrats very eager to get rid of Tom Corbett, who was governor. And they saw this guy's ad and said, he looks good enough, boom. So the Rob McCords of the world, the treasurer who was supposed to be the number one, saw it slipping away. And again, that's what motivated him to shake down these vendors to get more money. And the same thing happened with Chaka Fattah when he was congressman and he ran for mayor. He finished, I think you said third, John.
Third or fourth, yeah.
Distant way back, and they had contribution limits in Philadelphia, and he took a big loan from somebody and made it seem as though it was his own money, because if you put your own money in, there are no contribution limits, and he got smoked. And
Back to northeastern PA, one reason we think it was so corrupt over the years is we have 2 attorney generals from Scranton who have been convicted of felonies and are out of office as a result of it.
One of each party, by the way.
Yeah, one of each party, bipartisan removal, if you will. And we have the worst judicial scandal possibly in the country.
Cash
with
for
the
Kids.
Cash for Kids case, and judges getting rich off of sending kids to detention center that they had a financial, private detention center they had a financial interest in. So it's these kind of cases are huge, and that parlays a lot into looking at this as a bad case. But why is it like it is? I was riding with a friend of mine, and she's from the Scranton area, and I said, why is it so corrupt up there? What is it? She goes, well, it's job selling, and she goes, I know a guy. And I know a guy means a whole lot. It's not just something to to get where you
your
get new
gear.
tires or you take your car to get it fixed.
Yeah.
It's the whole thing revolves around a greased wheel, and that can lead to money greasing the wheel.
There's a lot of politicos in NEPA where you can't go directly to them. You have to talk to their guy, who then arranges the interviews and stuff. So it's just a different culture.
But we have to take a break at this point, and when we come back, we want to start out with John talking about the Vince of Darkness.
Yes.
So we'll be right back.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, the largest, most influential municipal association in the Commonwealth. Since 1921, PSATS has been preserving and strengthening township government and securing greater visibility and involvement for townships in the state and federal political arenas. Covering 95% of Pennsylvania's land mass, townships represent 5.5 million residents, more than any other type of political subdivision in Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Visit pahighwayinfo.org.
Hi, welcome back. Maura and I today are being joined by Chris Nicholas, Brad Bumstead, and John Baer. And as I said before the break, John, I wanted to come to you to talk about one of the most interesting figures when we talk about Pennsylvania political corruption, which is, of course, Senator Vince Fumo. Vince Fumo was a guest on this show many years ago, and he was incredibly engaging. No question was off limits. And we had a wonderful show with him, but that was one part of his personality. What part of his personality got him in trouble, John?
Well, most of it. Unfortunately, he disobeyed rules when he was in prison, and if you're a prisoner, all your emails are public. He was having emails with his psychiatrist, and his psychiatrist is spelling out the reasons that he did what he did, and the reasons was he's addicted. He's addicted to power, addicted to women, addicted to objects, had to have everything and anything he saw, when and where he wanted it. Vince was, you're absolutely right, he's completely engaging individual. He was a joy to report on and about. I had a wonderful time with him. I once introduced him at an event, and I said, he's been called Octo-Vince, he's been called the Vince of Darkness. And he stood up and he said, "Yeah, mostly by you." So the Daily News, you may remember, was not a reverent publication, and Vince was a perfect character for us to be writing about. This is a guy who was a member of Mensa. He was a licensed pilot, a licensed electrician, a licensed plumber, owned properties all over the East Coast, including a 100-acre farm here in Dauphin County, and just got into trouble by extending the power that he had, which was awesome, even as a member of the minority Senate for most of his career. If there was anything going to happen, it was going to happen because Vince would agree with it. And one little anecdote, when Josh Shapiro, our current governor, was, I believe, a freshman lawmaker, he and Vince were working on something that they both wanted. And Josh did something that pissed Vince off, and Vince pulled the plug on it, even though it was something that Vince, wanted. Now, he could go back at another time and get it back, but Shapiro was quoted as saying he was impressed at the commitment Vince had to getting what he wanted. So.
And one of my two favorite stories in the entire podcast series at PA Political Digest was Vince had this, he had like a bunch of homes, John said, we think 5 or 6, and altogether, all of the floors in his homes equaled 19. So altogether, he had 19 stories in his various homes. So he did what anybody would do. He went to the Oric vacuum store and he bought 19 vacuums, and one for each floor in his mansions and his farm and his, oceanfront condo in Florida. And that always stuck with me because, one, he bought it using what he called OPM, other people's money. Even though he was wealthy, he basically pilfered it from other people. And at the time this story came out, I too had an Oric vacuum. Now I have a 2-story Cape Cod. I only bought one, such a piker I am. But it really stuck with me that here's a guy who has all of this, and he goes and buys 19 Oric vacuums and uses other people's money to pay for it. So that...
Then you can bet he never used himself.
Oh, I asked John on the
Yeah,
podcast, I'm
no
like, do you
way.
think he did his own vacuuming? And I think John
And
gave me a
Brad
death
said
stare.
he was just being nice to his staff.
Thoughtful, very
The
thoughtful.
poor Senate staffers or the
Yeah.
housekeepers who had to do all that. So again, that to me was just, some people committed corruption to try and become governor. Others did it because they wanted a cleaner carpet in their houses. So it's
Well,
just,
increase their power, too.
yeah, to have all those Oric vacuums floating around.
Well, one thing with Senator Fumo, we had a slight disagreement about this just in terms of emphasis is all. But John and I both saw the other side of Vince Fumo, too, and it's positive. I mean, I think I made the statement that if I were a poor person living in South Philadelphia and I needed something done, he's the guy I would have wanted doing it. And his staff later came out and had numbers after he went to prison or was convicted, that $8 billion in additional appropriations beyond the normal amount that went to Philadelphia, Vince had gotten through over the years to help people. So, I mean, look, he was corrupt, he was a crook, he did all these things, but he also did some good work, too.
Well, that is always why I called him the Robin Hood of South Philadelphia, much to Chris's chagrin. We know that Chris has a different view on this, but
yeah.
wasn't he Robin Hood?
Well,
Well,
here's...
wasn't he doing his job?
Well, that's what I said. I said,
Yeah,
look,
do his
I
job.
don't give legislators kudos for doing their job. He's supposed to help his constituents. That's what he gets paid for.
He
now,
was just masterful.
oh, yeah, now, whatever his legislative salary was just, a minor stipend in his life. But that was, I think, probably the biggest disagreement we had. And John was like, look, he provided endless copy for us.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, okay, you're a journalist, I'm not. So I never like to say, well, he was terrible and corrupt, but he did bring money back. And I pointed out in the episode that if Philadelphia got $8 billion extra, that means some other part of the state got $8 billion less. And that
One
to
quick
me is a
anecdote,
story.
Charlie. When I used to travel with him on election day in Philadelphia, because that was always a hoot. I mean, he would had a very large vehicle, and it would include him, 2 or 3 very large individuals, and myself. And we were going to a polling place in South Philly, very narrow streets, as you know, and his large vehicle clips the side mirror on a woman's car who comes screaming out of a house in curlers and a robe, just yelling, yelling, yelling. One of the large individuals gets out and starts peeling off 20s until she stops. And then Vince never even looked. I mean, we just all went inside, but I looked back and watched this. Here you go, here you go.
And I thought it was,
Love that
I
story.
thought it was funny that John had to take a moment to point out that it was a narrow street in South Philly.
Well, this is for our Greene County listeners.
Every street in South
Well,
Philly.
speaking of Greene County, when I worked for the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, a constant theme among legislators from that area, not Greene County, but Western Pennsylvania, was, look, we're getting the short end of the stick out here. The money is really going to Philadelphia, and Vince sort of proves that they were right.
So what,
All this extra money went there.
one of the most famous Pennsylvania scandals involved an actual suicide on television, live television, with Bud Dwyer. Very sad. I mean, there's a lot of sadness, as a lobbyist I know used to say, there's a lot of sadness in the world. That was particularly awful, especially for everybody who is in the room. Thankfully, we haven't had any additional
Yes.
scenes
Thankfully.
like that. What do you make of it? Like, what has been the lasting impact of?
Well, let me set the scene, then I'll let them talk about it. Is he'd been convicted of bribery and corruption.
2 minutes.
He was about to be sentenced the next day, where he would then lose access to his pension. So he committed suicide on camera. He ate his gun. So that way he would still be a state employee when he died, and his wife and family would have access to his $1 million plus pension.
There's no doubt, I mean, he was convicted of bribery, even though he didn't take any money. You don't have to. He agreed to take a bribe. A jury convicted him of that. But was he really guilty? Did he actually do it? Those questions, continue. There's a lot of doubt among some of his supporters that he did what he did, and that he really wasn't guilty. But after he was convicted, that's why he went through this, to save his family and his pension and everything else. He claimed that he was a victim of conspiracy by former Governor Dick Thornburg. I interviewed a lot of people about it, including Governor Thornburg, and there just really wasn't any evidence of that.
So if your viewers want to learn more, Charlie, where do they go? PAPoliticaldigest.com.
And on that note, we are out of time, but there's lots more corruption to talk about, and we have the best people in the state here to talk about it. We'll see you next week on Behind the Headlines.